There's more to life than books, but not much more. Okay, so here we're meeting up, myself, Bruce Bax, and my friend Rod Waterman. We met each other in university days, and we're not really pondering the great issues the world seems to be pondering at the moment, like what was Prince Philip like, or is a burger a sandwich, amongst two of them. We're just going to talk today about a number of bands that meant an enormous amount to us in our youth and still do, I think, perhaps even more so. So, how's the book situation with you, Rod? Are you a hoarder?
I'd say I'm a hoarder, but I am an accumulator. Is there a distinction there? I have a lot of
Sure.
books. I'm actually trying to get rid of some books so that I don't become that person. But um, yeah, I'm a
Well,
bookish
okay.
person.
Okay, so that allows me to become that person instead because I'm a complete hoarder in terms of books and records. They're kind of overflowing on the shelf. Now, what we kind of agreed to talk about was some bands who I don't think have officially been grouped as a literary set of bands, but they were bands that we both sort of seized on in the early 80s because their experience seemed to speak to us all. And what we're going to do today, we're going to give 15 minutes each to four of these bands, starting with the Go-Betweens, moving on to the Smiths, then REM, and rounding up with Aztec Camera, who seem to have some things in common. Perhaps you could say something about that, Rod. What is it that unites all these bands somehow?
Well, they seem to share a sensibility, even though they seem also somewhat disparate musically. But and part of that sensibility is, I think, an affinity for other art forms that influence their work. It seems that they are mostly what you might call bookish bands. Not to say that they're nerdy, um, but they sort of wear some of their literary influences on their sleeves, I think, and that might be the unifying factor for this conversation, anyway. And
Yeah,
I have some thoughts
yeah.
about where that originally might come from that hopefully will come out in our conversation.
And I think we both seized upon them because we felt we had a kind of affinity, a common feeling for what the sound of the records and the lyrics of the records and the basic sensibility there. But let's go through and talk about that. I thought it would be a good idea to start with Go-Betweens because in a lot of ways they represent characteristics of this kind of band as well as any of the ones we're going to talk about. Could you just say something about how you chanced upon the Go-Betweens and what they meant to you at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably sort of led me to them. I was aware of them, but not acutely aware of them before we met, and you already knew about them. I think it was probably Cattle and Cane that was the entree for me because it's such a gorgeous song and it's one of their earlier songs, and it, like a lot of their things, it should have been a big hit. And part of the tragedy of the Go-Betweens, or part maybe it wasn't a tragedy, but that they wanted to be successful in crossover and they never quite did, and that sort of did them in the end. But
Mm.
there was something delicate about their sensibility, but also something very strong at the same time, and that is definitely evidenced in Cattle and Cane, which is a Grant McLennan song. Because the Go-Betweens, we should say, sort of split the songwriting between the two songwriters, Robert Forster and Grant McLennan, and then they had quite different styles that somehow blended together wonderfully well, where they alternated more or less songs on their albums, and Grant tended to have the poppier sensibility of the two, I think, and that came across in the songs that people think about when they think about the Go-Betweens tend to be Grant songs, whether it's Bachelor Kisses or Streets of Your Town, or this Cattle and Cane, which I'm thinking about now.
Right, right. Oh, I didn't realize I might have introduced you to them. I sort of became aware of them probably through the music papers, which we both kind of devoured at that point. And the Go-Betweens are one of the ultimate critics band who couldn't transfer that to commercial success for whatever reason. I think for a number of reasons. I mean, it's one thing that doesn't actually surprise me. Maybe it did at the time, but with kind of reflection, it doesn't surprise me that they weren't an enormous chart sensation, because they were awkward. They were for a certain kind of constituency. They were for the likes of you and me, frankly. Okay, sensitive, kind of bookish types, but they were awkward. But what's been interesting about them is how they've had a second life in the last few years. Since Robert Forster wrote Grant and I, and Box Set came out, they've made a film, the documentary has been made, and just now I'm working my way through Tracy Thorn's kind of answer to Grant and I in some ways, which he's written about Lindy Morrison, the Go-Betweens drummer. And it's really staggeringly good. And I think you wrote to me and said, oh, you're a bit concerned that you might sort of like Robert and Grant less after reading it, but I don't think you will, because it just tells the whole story. It's quite a painful book to read in a lot of ways, but it's a very powerful one.
Yeah, there is something tragic at the heart of the Go-Betweens, I think, and I think that resides in Grant. And he was a sad person who wrote lovely songs, and I think he kind of got lost in his sadness in a way, especially when the band broke up and he and his bandmate girlfriend broke up as well, and so I think that sort of really took him down a bad road. But so maybe I'll introduce my theory now because it seems opposite. Because I believe that all of the bands we're talking about, maybe all of them, but I think all of them, really spring from capital R romanticism. So not lowercase r, not just romance about people falling in love, but the romanticism that came out of the Wordsworth and Coleridge, that kind of romanticism, whose tropes are childhood, innocence and experience, sort of a nostalgia of certain kind, a reverence for nature, those kinds of things you can discern in the work of a lot of these bands. And Cattle and Cane is, I think, a exhibit A in that theory, where it starts by speaking about childhood and then it continues to talk about the natural world, and it's almost like a modernized version of something Wordsworth or Coleridge might have written from Australia. It seems to resonate for me, and so I think that's an interesting thing for me to have kind of come across and sort of test it against other songs by these bands and see if it works. And it seems to resonate for me a little bit, that, and so there's another tie-in that I think is interesting. They're not on our list of bands to discuss because they don't necessarily quite fit. But in the film about Joy Division, Control, there's a really weird and interesting scene where Ian Curtis, when they're at school, he and two friends, one boy and one girl, are in somebody's bedroom. I think it's his bedroom, and he starts reciting Wordsworth's "My Heart Leaped Up" from memory, and they're just spellbound by his. And they say, "What's that?" They don't even know what it is, and he said, "That's Wordsworth." And I hadn't thought about that before. I remember at the time thinking it was very strange and what a moment in the film, but it seemed to tie back to me to that connection that these bands had to a romantic sensibility. And so anyway, that's my sort of microwave theory of what these bands kind of have in common, or where they might be coming from.
Wow. That's some theory. I'm not surprised you wanted to express it early. Yeah, I can definitely see where that's coming from. I mean, it should be said that the bands we're going to talk about, and we've got the idea of talking about four more. So that's the Triffids, Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, Prefab Sprout, and Echo and the Bunnymen, who started off slightly earlier. But all of these bands did have precedents. There were a lot of autodidacts came out of punk. And Ian Curtis, I can understand, Kevin Rowland, the guys in the Specials, a lot of them from pretty working class backgrounds who just pulled themselves up and kind of expressed themselves in these set of incredible records that came out towards the end of the 70s and into the 80s. Now, by 82, when a lot of the bands we're going to talk about started to appear, things were drying up. And there was a lot of what I thought was kind of ugly and irrelevant music coming into the charts. A lot of it synth-based, but not all of it. And these bands came up at a sort of when they were much needed, I think. And you're right about the romanticism. So I listened through to the Go-Betweens through all of their key albums, starting from Before Hollywood just a few days ago. And it's an extraordinary journey about a group of people moving into adulthood and a kind of partnership, because it was a very close partnership between Forster and McLennan. And it's also important that they were in the UK struggling in London and not getting the recognition except in the music papers that they felt they deserved, and not getting dropped by record labels and jumping from one to another, but still coming out with extraordinary stuff. It was just really, really interesting. But there's an element that is painful, like you say, and I think it mostly comes from Grant. I think before you read these books, that you think that Robert Forster is the awkward one and the difficult one and the problematic one. But actually you realise, having done so, how solid he is because of the background that he comes from. And in Cattle in Cane, very early on, Grant talks about this is the father's watch. And his father died when he was very young. And you can really feel that pain in some of his songs, in Bachelor Kisses and so on, and in a lot of his stuff. Whereas actually sort of reflecting the Robert Forster stuff, because it's so good-humoured and quirky humoured, it's more robust somehow. And you realise, actually, having gone through it, that he'll be okay, you know. But
agree with that. And it's deceptive, because on the surface it feels like Robert is the darker one of the two, because he's more angular, I think, in his songwriting, and Grant seems like he's the gentler one because his songs are so melodic and sweet. But there's a much more darkness in Grant's songs, I think, than there is in Robert's. So it's almost like they're flipped around in some way, that the way that they seem to be is not the way that they are. Grant had a lot of darkness in his life.
Yes, it's one of those very sad deaths, Grant McLennan, just as the Go-Betweens were coming back with some really strong material after they reformed. Their last album is just really staggeringly good and deserves to be seen on the same level as the stuff that they put out in the 80s. And they were getting recognition, they were selling, which it still seems like one of those really sad deaths, even years later,
I remember exactly where I was when I learned that he died. I was devastated. I remember exactly where I was and how I felt, and I was just really, really upset by his death. It seemed so wrong.
Yeah, but a great set of songs anyway, a great variety, and I think like you said, I think what makes the Go-Betweens stand out is the two angles that they come from as songwriters, that it's complementary. But I would say that the Tracy Thorn book is a must read for anybody who's fond of the band and who it's meant to, and that's a lot of people actually, because it tells the story of how important she was, and how, to a certain degree, because of being a strong, independent woman, she made a lot of people quite nervous and uneasy and actually was an important role within the band, because she stood up to people in a way that Robert and Grant couldn't.
Well, that's it. I'm really looking forward to reading that book, and I'm glad that it came out at this time and you mentioned it, because it brings me to another thing I want to say about the Go-Betweens and bookishness or literary stuff, because the other song that I wanted to talk about was Karen, which is a really interesting song, because it's because I believe the Go-Betweens are a feminist band, and I believe they, genuinely have feminist principles. I mean, you know, they sort of credited, I think, a premenstrual tension medicine on one of their album liner notes. You know, they're definitely have a feminist bones all over them, their bodies. But this book, I believe, probably sort of sets some of that into context, where, you know, Lindy Morrison, female drummer, which is, you know, an unusual thing that Robert and Grant thought was a very cool thing to have. And not only that, but she's, I think, a great drummer. But there is a certain tension between their belief in their feminism and perhaps some of the things that weren't quite feminist in action. And the song Karen is about a female librarian, which I think is a very interesting setting for a song by a band like that. And it's interesting that the lyric, and I have it pulled up on my phone, it says, helps me find Hemingway, helps me find Genet, helps me find Brecht, helps me find Chandler, helps me find James Joyce. She always makes the right choice. And I thought about this in the context of their feminism. And I thought, well, this is interesting because, you know, here we have a female librarian helping a man find books to read. It's like, well, yeah. I mean, Karen's, the sexy librarian, is a trope, right? But they're also sort of clambering on the shoulders of women to enact their feminism and their literary credentials, both with Lindy Morrison and Karen, you know. So I think that's an interesting and somewhat funny and ironic twist there. So I wanted to get that in as well.
I'm very glad you mentioned that, actually, because I was thinking of that song, but it also reminds me of very much what I was like in my teenage years before university. Spent so much time haunting libraries, looking for the books I felt I needed to read to construct myself around, and so on. I didn't really notice the librarians, I have to say, but the song also sort of nails down a certain kind of late adolescent male and that process of constructing their identity around books. And the list there is just right of who he names. That's excellent. Well, I think that rounds off the go-betweens, because we're trying to work by sort of quarter hour per band to get this done in an hour if we can. So let's move on to the Smiths now. And obviously when it comes to the Smiths, there's an elephant in the room, which we'll discuss, I'm sure, within this 15 minutes. But I'd like to start by just saying that how staggering their impact was in the 80s when they arrived. And it's very difficult for me to imagine the 80s without the Smiths looking back, because they had such fundamental centrality for so many people. So I'm sure you agree with me on that one. Just sort of what are your thoughts on the Smiths in general?
Oh yeah, I mean they hit me like a train. I mean, I think they're an amazing band, and all really all the way through their catalog, there isn't really anything. There's no weaknesses in their catalog, and I'm sorry they broke up, and I still lament the fact that they broke up. But on the other hand, they left us with nothing bad. Except for the fact that the first album was produced rather strangely and it sounded kind of flat, but the songs are amazing. But I mean, I'd be hard. I don't know. I'd say I keep thinking I'd be hard pressed to find my favorite album, but I probably think it's Hatful of Hollow, because it seems that that's their most true self. But they didn't make a bad album, and they maybe made a couple of average singles, but they were just so powerful and so original. I mean, I saw them live, and I still don't understand how Johnny Marr does what he does or did what he did with that guitar. I do not understand how one person can make all of those sounds at once. It's amazing to me. And Morrissey's lyrics are just exquisite. I mean, they're hilarious, they're sad, they're witty, they're smart, and it's awful that he turned into what he turned into. But for a moment there, he had everybody in the palm of his hand, and still has some people in the palm of his hand. I think that combination of Morrissey and Marr with that rhythm section behind them was just unbeatable in my view.
Absolutely. I mean, it's difficult to explain to people about Morrissey, that the impact he had, because nobody had ever written lyrics like that before, with that particular kind of impact, that kind of emotional impact. There were precedents for the Smiths. Doing some research, I came across some interesting comparisons. Barney Hoskins, when talking about their first year, said seeing them live, it was like Tim Buckley fronting the Nightingales. Oh, and then he talked about Buzzcocks marrying Burt Bacharach and so on. And these comparisons seem so odd in retrospect, when the Smiths don't need to be compared with anybody because their impact was so strong. But of course, journalists need that when someone arrives, need to describe it in some ways. I mean, I think Morrissey's contribution was kind of as the outsider, outside society and so on, which appealed to so many people at that certain age, where you look upon yourself in that kind of way too. But I think the difference with him, he's remained an outsider, whereas for most of us, we've got that outsider perspective when we're at that age, but really we want to be on the inside, we want to belong. And Morrissey is so contrary that he's remained on the outside. I always thought his Oscar Wilde fixation was a bit too much, actually. And I'd look at that as part of the way that he's gone and his political opinions now, which I have to say are totally repugnant. And I've no time for Morrissey at all now whatsoever. There's no excuse for the kind of things that he's coming out with. But it doesn't diminish what listening to a Smith song is like for me. And I'm not going to deny myself the pleasure of listening to those great records, because I think he's a total arse now. I don't see why we should. If he's trashed his legacy, then it's a cross that he has to bear rather than anybody else. You know, he's still got the records and memories to go back to, you know.
It's surprising in a way, because he is, you know, obviously of Irish descent, and you know he wrote a whole album whose title was about his blend of English and Irishness. So you'd think he would understand the immigrant sensibility and the immigrant experience, and not sort of become the, I guess, bigot is the word to use that he's become. So that's a strange thing. But in terms of the literary stuff, I mean, he wore that on his sleeve for sure. I mean, Cemetery Gates, for example, on The Queen is Dead, cites, Keats, Yeats, and Oscar Wilde all at once. And, to go back to the Romanticism theory that I espoused before, I mean, we have songs set on the moors, about Myra Hindley and the Moors murders and so on. But nevertheless, there is a sort of a sense of a lonely romantic wanderer about Morrissey, the sort of the solitary man, if he's on a bicycle or not, the charming, powerful ego of the romantic is Morrissey in some ways, but turned into a sort of a shy, afraid, bookish, lonely person. I think that's something that certainly boys of our age at that time could really relate to. I don't know what it felt like, for female listeners. I don't know if there was a strong a feeling about the Smiths among women.
I think there was, actually. I think Morrissey appealed to both. It actually took me a while to totally fall for it, for the Morrissey thing. But I agree with you about the first album coming across as rather dour to some extent, and then because they were so gifted and they had so many songs just flying out of them at that point. I think that was quite a universal response to that first album, which I now really I listen to for 4 songs really. Reel Round the Fountain, You've Got Everything Now, Still Ill, and Suffer Little Children. It's got the singles on which we knew already, but if you compare with the songs that they left off it, some of their best songs were B-sides. Jean is a staggering song, and A Hatful of Hollow, It's All There, This Night Has Opened My Eyes, and so on. What's interesting is Morrissey was just born for the music papers. He'd spent the 70s writing letters to the NME, and I read again Barney Hoskins' review with him and interview with him just at the height of the early Smiths, where Barney Hoskins is essentially trying to be Morrissey in the way that he writes the article, and quotes Jean Genet, Nietzsche, and Barthes in the process, which was what was going on in the Enemy, particularly right through the early 80s. And it was pretentious, sure, but it was an education for the likes of you and me at the
Absolutely.
same time, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of cut my teeth on the Enemy at that point. I mean, it really informed my life almost completely. I mean, people like Ian Pemman and Paul Morley wrote things that I didn't understand, but I kept going back to them because they were just so erudite, and
Yeah.
overtly intellectual and maybe pseudo intellectual in some cases, but nevertheless, it was compelling to me. And I think we were lucky to get the Enemy at the age that we did, because we got a golden age of the Enemy, I think, because the writing itself was so good about bands that were so good. So we got the best of everything there, I believe.
Absolutely.
And funny enough, Jean Genet comes up again. He's in Karen, and now he's in this Smiths talk as well. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about Jean Genet as a major player in this.
So go and read Jean Genet, kids. I've read a Jean Genet. I've read Thief's Journal. I can concur. It's something else. It's something else. But I agree with you about the literary element in this interview. They ask Morrissey about his influences. Obviously, the kitchen sink films, and he was an education to me, and those novels. Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, and it was such an education to me that sent me to all of those films. And it went at a time when you could still, I was brought up in London, go and watch those films on an afternoon in Scala, these independent cinemas that put them on. So it really, but Morrissey also mentions Thomas Hardy. I think it's perfectly clear that the Brontes are there too, and Oscar Wilde and that fin de siècle stuff too. That if you look at Morrissey becoming obnoxious, it's perfectly clear there in the interviews. You can read them the same way. He said a lot of fairly out of order things during his time in the Smiths, which came out later, but he was in such a marriage, and we've spoken about Morrissey, but it was really a partnership. And like you say, Johnny Marr was quite extraordinary to help him realize his ability. And he might easily have fallen through the cracks had Marr not sort of knocked on his door. Because if you look at what the Smiths might have been in their early days, and it was as much sort of Marr's sort of persistence and vision that drove them into the great band that they were. And you could easily have seen an alternative career path for Morrissey had he not met him, which would be a kind of footnote, be a kind of oddity, an eccentricity. He was given the platform for that talent, and not just by Marr, because the other two were both outstanding musicians as well, which is a part of the tragedy of the Smiths, because they were treated so poorly by both Morrissey and Marr, really.
Yeah. I want to say a little bit about Morrissey's autobiography, which is much maligned, but I really enjoyed it. And it has an enormously long section about the litigation with the rhythm section about songwriting credits, which he's still very angry about, and which is why he doesn't live in England anymore, because of the judgment against him. But I think it's hilarious that he insisted that book be published in Penguin Classics.
Yes.
As a literary work, right? And looking like a classic of the kind that he would have been, reading and having in his back pocket as a youth. And so that ties ties us back into the literary aspect of the conversation, that he was dedicated to the idea of himself as a literary figure to the extent that he would only have his memoir published by Penguin Classics.
Yes,
that's quite funny.
Absolutely. Okay, we're halfway through this chat, which is good timing to move on to the next. We're going to talk about REM now. Now, anybody who's known me to any degree will be well used to me banging on about REM. Now, it's really just because they hit me at exactly the right time in my youth and really felt like my discovery and so on. When I came upon Murmur, bought it, and pretty much listened to it ragged for the next year until Reckoning came out. So I know I'm very, very dull on this subject, but people talk about a safe place, and I always think about REM, those first three albums, as a safe place for me, because it was really just me coming into myself, beginning to construct myself, and they were the right band for me at the right time. They weren't so outspoken or megaphone-ish as Morrissey was in the Smiths. They were very modest and self-effacing, which kind of appealed to me. And I kind of think of Peter Buck and Michael Stipe, who were in many respects the heart of the band, although they were a very democratic band, as kind of body and soul, with Stipe as the soul and Buck as the body. And they're always a safe place for me, and I still never tire of those first three albums because there's such a warmth to them, there's such melody, there's such emotion, and there's still such mystery. And I've been listening to those albums for almost 30 years now. So now I've just got that off my chest. I'll pass REM on to you, Rod.
Well, I feel like REM, they belong to you, Bruce, really. I mean, they don't belong to anybody else except you. They're your band and yours alone in some ways, as I know your deep love for them. But I love them too, and I got really deeply into them. But I got it backwards. The first album I got was Reckoning, and I thought it was an amazing album. And then I got Murmur afterwards, which is an interesting way to go. And it changes the sort of prism through which I see them in a way, because my first exposure was Harbor Coat, and Seven Chinese Brothers and all those songs. But the fascinating, well, there's lots of fascinating things about REM, but one of them is that I agree, those first three albums are for me the peak of what they did, and I didn't really pursue them much after that because I didn't kind of want to have my bubble burst or something. And until Automatic came out, and then I got back in again. But I did buy the other albums, but I didn't really fall in love with them in the same way that I did the first three. But the key for me about those albums is that they're impossible to understand lyrically. I mean, I have no idea what he's saying, let alone what he's talking about. And it isn't until later that they start to publish the lyrics, and you can read them, not from those albums, but from later albums. And so they're deliberately opaque, but they're so enticing and tantalizing that you want to understand, but you cannot understand. And so you just have to, they're like some kind of a palimpsest. You sort of layer on your own meaning that may or may not be accurate, but you can make it into something that suits what you want it to be. It's sort of like a Rorschach of who you are in a way. But I think that's the genius of those albums, is that they allow you in and they keep you out at the same time.
Yes, I mean it's sort of in my research, the review of Murmur said that this record by Richard Grable, who was the NME's US correspondent, it took a while for REM to get here. It said this record needs to be listened to 2 or 3 times before it fully clicks. Now I think it needs to be listened to about 50 times. Actually, and that's what I did with it. I listened to it again and again and listened to something different going on. I could follow the guitar, I could follow the bass, I could follow the weird studio effects, I could follow the vocals, the backing vocals, which was such an innovation, something to bring to the table. There weren't any other bands doing quite that, of that pure emotion coming across. And Smiths and REM came out together, and they went in, their careers rose in kind of parallel directions in some ways, and the bands did have contact, but they were quite distinct as bands, even though they were both based on Rickenbacker and bass and drums and so on. They were quite distinct in that Morrissey was so upfront and in your face, where Stipe, it was all sort of enigma and obscurity. And I agree with you. I followed through from there. And because of the loyalty that I had, I still made a big thing of them. I can still remember the first time I heard Losing My Religion and so on. But they were having less and less of an impact on me. And now when I go back, it's primarily those three records plus Chronic Town and the Dead Letter Office, which is the
Yeah.
B-sides,
Hmm.
which I go to, not to diminish what came afterwards, but just because of what that meant to me at the time. It was my journey, you know. It was really my journey, and I have to stop myself getting too emotional about it because I really feel I owe that band something in a way that I don't owe anybody else. I wouldn't say, you know, because it was so much part of my life journey, you know.
Yeah, I think I remember getting very lost in those two or three albums. I mean, when Fables came out, the third album, I was living in Germany, and I played that album non-stop, literally
Mm,
non-stop for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months. I could not. I mean, that's when they sort of their sort of mythologizing sort of clarified itself. I think they're sort of building up to Fables in a way with the first two albums, and there's a sort of
mm,
a clarity about Fables that it's still mysterious, but you can actually sort of start to, it comes into a certain focus, I think, that the other two albums didn't have. Not to say that the
absolutely.
Fables is better, it's just that they're
Mm,
building,
mm,
the lens is kind of focusing in to the point where Fables of the Reconstruction actually has a clarity that the other two maybe don't. So it's still mysterious, but it's a bit less obscure.
yes,
So
yes.
for example, you can actually understand the words that Michael Stipe is saying, even if you don't still understand them.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
and
Yeah, I
but
mean,
they're all
mm, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, you go on.
Okay, I mean, I can remember personal experience with those first three albums. I've already spoken about what Murmur went to me, but I can remember the experience of going and buying Reckoning with my sister. We lived in Teddington and we walked all the way along the road, Bushy Park, to Kingston across the bridge, bought it. It's just a very, very memorable day for me, and my sister will remember it too. And then getting back and thinking, putting it on and thinking, what's this? It doesn't sound like Murmur. Murmur was so ingrained in me, and they deliberately made a reaction to that. Just got in the studio, blasted it all out, got out of the studio within a 10 or 12 days, I think. And I had the same experience when I came back. I'd spent my gap year 6 months in Switzerland, came back and bought Fables and listened to that, and then again thought, what's that again? Because they'd reinvented themselves. Again, perhaps it doesn't sound so much like that for younger listeners if you listen to their albums now, but I would say, just for me, because I've built up so much anticipation, and as any kind of fan, I think naturally I want the same experience. I like this. I want the same experience. And then for those two albums in particular, they definitely made a reaction to the one before. I mean, to put them in a literary context, the literary context is quite clear. It's the context of the Deep South and those great Southern writers. So you'd say Faulkner, Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, Truman Capote, Eudora Welty, and so on, and so many more. I mean, I think Rod, you did an MA at something related to this, so perhaps you could say something there.
Yeah, I didn't write about REM, but I did write about Carson McCullers, and I had this theory about the grotesque, and Carson McCullers, because her books are so sort of littered with odd, misfits, who either have some kind of physical or emotional deformity. And so I had this sort of highfalutin theory about what that might mean. But it does seem to, now you mention it, tie into something about REM, because I think Michael Stipe is one of those misfits in a way.
Mm,
And he is a grotesque, and not, I don't mean this in a bad way. It's a sort of it's a term of art, really, that comes from Rabelais and all that kind of stuff.
mhm,
But I think
mhm,
Michael Stipe is one of those misfits from the Deep South, and he comes out of, it's almost like he's out of a Faulkner novel or out of a McCullers novella, in a way himself. And it's interesting that he and Morrissey are similar types in a way. You know, they're outsiders, and as it turns out, both, you know, we didn't know this at the time, but both gay men who were kind of wrestling with who they were. And so they were actually outsiders who were trying to figure out a way to fit in, or decide not to fit in, as the case may be. And I think that kind of character is all over Southern Gothic fiction, if you like. So it's the backing vocals are a fascinating aspect of REM, I think, because it's almost like there's this Greek chorus behind Michael Stipe doing all kinds of weird and wonderful things while he's doing his weird and wonderful thing.
That's a great description of it, and there's plenty of that sort of Greek element, certainly on Murmur, particularly a couple of songs, Laughing and West of the Fields, that's really foregrounded. But as per the thing about the eccentricity, that really comes from to the core on Fables, because there are any number of songs on there about Southern eccentrics, on Life and How to Live It, on Old Man Kenzie, on Wendell G. And there are more. It's all about this oddity, this eccentricity, but this eccentricity that is tolerated and cherished in the South, which I think is the distinction I'd put between that and the Smiths and Morrissey. Morrissey always comes across as rather embattled and certainly embittered and so on. But there's a gentleness and warmth to those first REM records. And like I said, it's a comparison between Buck and Stipe, I think. Buck, in some kind of ways, he's a traditional kind of rock and roll figure in terms of that sort of guitar, the way he was on stage and so on. But he's obviously kind of warm and tolerant and very, very nice guy. And that comes across in REM, and the distinction between them and the Smiths, where the Smiths had all ended up in court, whereas REM made a decision very, very early on that we're going to divide the royalties, that it goes between us, and they all contributed to the songs right the way through. Bill Berry's responsible for a lot of their greatest songs, which is something that people didn't realize. And it's why they really came to an end when Bill Berry decided to go. And it was unfortunate, that long last act, because you never realized really how important a drummer could be in the band. Although you'd have to say, we could go back to the Go-Betweens on that one, which is only really coming to the fore now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, drummers, are underrated. I read 2 drummer memoirs last summer, and it just brought home to me how important those figures are in a band. I mean, the Chris Frantz book, obviously, being the biggest one of those. But yeah, I think that Fables of the Reconstruction, or Reconstruction of the Fables, which is another thing in way in which they sort of mystify, is that you don't even know what the title of that album actually is. Is it Fables of the Reconstruction, or is it Reconstruction of the Fables? Because it sort of goes around in a circle and keeps on a loop, Fables of the Reconstruction of the Fables. And so you're like, well, I don't even know what to call this album. We've decided to call it Fables because it's easier. But the word Reconstruction is an interesting and important word, because they're from Athens, Georgia, right? The heart of the Deep South, and to live in a post-slavery South, is a weird place to be. And it's still a weird place to be even now. Yes. And as we've seen with recent events in Georgia, that stuff isn't over. Reconstruction is still happening. Jim Crow is even making a comeback, for God's sake.
Yes.
So, yes. It must be a very odd place to live as a group of young white men, aware of all of the injustice that preceded you and that still surrounds you.
Okay, that's great. You've summed it up again, Rod. Thank you very much for that. So glad to have got a lot of that REM stuff on tape for myself at long last.
You should write a book about it, Bruce.
Well, perhaps I go to some way to working this out of my system, but I don't think either of us ever will, because when we're talking about these bands, they still mean the same to me all these years later, because they're such strong records. And we come last of all to Aztec Camera. And Aztec Camera, particularly for me, I have to focus on the one record, which is Highland Hard Rain. They did plenty of very good stuff after that, but Highland Hard Rain just set the bar so incredibly high for themselves and everybody else. And I still think it's the best album ever made about the whole experience of being 17. And it came out when I was 17. So how lucky was I? And I still listen to it and it makes me feel like I'm 17 again. And it's just a phenomenal record. And I don't quite understand why it's not more universally rated and recognized. What a masterpiece it is. Yeah. But I'll pass that on to you at this
I
point.
agree. It's a perfect album in many ways, I think, and it also, I mean, not to bang on this drum again, but it for me it is the enactment of romanticism,
Mm,
by a
mm,
17-year-old going through that transition from innocence to experience, um, set in the highlands, in a natural world, but engaging with urban life. I think it's a textbook version of romanticism in a way for me.
mm,
And the just the sweetness of Roddy Frame's voice, his ear for melody. He's just a virtuoso, but he's also a troubadour. He is that sort of like wandering minstrel.
mhm.
Like a poet. Walking the earth, singing his songs. And I think the
That's
more I think
really
about this,
nicely expressed. That's very nicely expressed.
I'm really wedded to this theory, Bruce.
Well, it's a good theory. It's a good theory, and it's kind of a unifying thing. You can see it. All of these bands were bookish. They took so much from books and films, and that is still there in those records when you feel it. What's incredible about Aztec Camera and that record is how realized it all is. And you think, and it came out when he was 17 or 18, but he wrote a lot of those songs when he was 15 or 16.
Crazy.
And it's I read an interview with him just before about him looking back. Okay, what do you think about the early stuff? And that's exactly what he says. I'm quite staggered to think that I wrote those songs when I was 15 or 16. And in many respects, if you listen to him in comparison with the other three great bands we've talked about, Go Between Smiths and REM, there seems to be more vulnerability and insecurity in all of those bands than there is in Aztec Camera. He just seems so assured and so confident, and the words that each song has been worked on to such a degree, the lyrics and the music, that it just couldn't be beaten, really. And there's not a weak spot on the whole record. There are some songs which mean more to me emotionally for certain reasons. I'd go to Lost Outside the Tunnel is a very important song to me because it seems to sum up the kind of adolescent experience, but there's not a weak song on that whole record. I think the one thing you could hold against it is some of the production, which seems a bit of its time, and particularly the drum sound. But there's nothing within the songs that could be bettered. And you might have something to say about this, because one of the immediate comparisons that you could make with Roddy Frame, and I knew he was complimented a lot by Elvis Costello at that point in time. Elvis Costello made a big thing of that album. And I can see the comparison to some degree because the lyrics are so worked on and chiseled, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember that, um, that endorsement by Elvis Costello, but I've not thought about a connection between them before. So that's an interesting idea. I mean, I suppose you could say that, you know, there was a certain amount of an angry young man to Roddy Frame, but it seemed that the
Yes.
sweetness of his voice kind of like sort of hid that and disguised it a little bit, you know. But there is a lot of, I don't say necessarily anger, but there's a lot of hard feeling in that album, you know.
It's interesting if you see him. I read through the interviews. He's quite a tough character, actually, round about that. There's no lack of self-confidence in himself, and he has a go at a few of his contemporaries as well, which kind of surprised me reading this, reading the interviews. And also talking about the literary side, the one conversation that he has about somebody who he's reading, he writes about Colin Wilson, who was one of the big figures of the Angry Young Men. He didn't initially come out writing fiction, I think, Colin Wilson. I think he wrote criticism, and I think he wrote a book called The Outsider and made an enormous splash in those days of the Angry Young Man, and then became a rather odd figure and a bit of a, I don't know whether the word is dilettante or real eccentric, and that he was writing all kinds of stuff about the occult and all kinds of things, and fell into obscurity and lost his reputation. But it's interesting you made the point about Roddy Frame, because that was the guy that he focused on in his interview. And Colin Wilson was a very angry writer indeed, actually. And that doesn't come across in Highland Hard Rain particularly. He's a very, very...
There does seem to be a concerted effort by Roddy Frame to sort of establish himself as somebody and somebody who he's defining and not wanting to be defined by other people. So, for example, on the first song of Oblivious, I think it's on Oblivious, it says, "They call us lonely when we're really just alone." And it's like, yes. So don't mistake my solitude for loneliness, right? And that's a very important distinction to make. And it comes back once again to my theory about romanticism. That, you know, that lonely wanderer, you know, but they're not necessarily lonely. They're just solitary. And there's a difference, you know. And he's plowing his own furrow in his own very, very dedicated way. And he is his own artist. And he will not be pushed around and turned into somebody else's artist. He is doing what he wants to do on his own terms. And that is a massively admirable thing, I think.
So where did Roddy Frame and Aztec Camera go from there? I mean, Aztec Camera were a band, clearly, but Frame's talent and his vision was so overpowering that it was clearly his show. And there was never any doubt about that. They went on, they signed to WEA. The next album was produced by Mark Knopfler, who's a bit of an anathema to post-punk types. And I like the record, and there are plenty of good songs on it. But it's by no means the statement that Highland Hard Rain was, and it's to some degree it's them trying to fit into a marketplace. And they did a lot of great songs thereafter. But like I said at the beginning of this, it was very, very difficult to match a statement like Highland Hard Rain, because that to me is just such an unbeatable classic. So Frame has had a very, very solid career, and he's had a number of hit singles, but maybe to a certain degree the comparison can be made with Lloyd Cole, who hopefully we'll talk about in the next episode of this, that he made a initial statement that was quite untoppable, even given his talent, you know.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I liked Knife. I thought Knife was good, but it felt like it, A, suffered from being produced by Mark Knopfler, and B, kind of, I felt like it tailed off. Like the first half was good, and then it just went in a direction, and I was like, oh, they seem to have lost their way a little bit. So I don't know if that's accurate. I haven't heard it in a while, but that's how I remember feeling about it at the time. But he, you know, you can't, you know, there's no denying the quality and the class of Roddy Frame's, you know, musicianship and his voice and his skill. I mean, that's always going to be there, you know.
Absolutely. I've got a good anecdote actually about Knife, which is still in my record collection, which I bought I think at the Virgin Megastore on Tottenham Court Road, and I bought it at a signing session. So I went with my younger sister and a few of her friends and so on, bought the album, and there were the band sitting at the table with their silver pens ready to sign it. And I bought the record, but I said to my sister and her friends, could you go up and get them to sign it? So there they were, these sweet sort of 16-year-old girls with Aztec Camera at the table and so on. So they all signed it. Love Owen, kiss, kiss. Love Roddy, kiss, kiss. And there it is, still in their silver pen, still in my record collection, with
really
all of
funny.
their kisses. And I'm still very grateful to the band for that. Okay, so I think we've come to an end with Aztec Camera. And like I say, I would like to have another sort of discussion, maybe a sort of few weeks down the line, where we talk about another 4 of these bands that fit into this category. And I was thinking the Triffids, okay, Prefab Sprout, Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, and Echo and the Bunnymen. And as I was thinking about these, when I was thinking about these bands, I wouldn't actually precedent or privilege any of the bands over the others. I mean, obviously, the Smiths and REM went on to have fabulous sort of sales and critical respect. But when I look back at these bands, I feel I owe them all something of what those records meant to me at the time. And I wouldn't, and they all said something kind of different and complementary as well, for which I still feel enormously grateful for, actually.
Yeah, they're all part of my personal canon for sure. I definitely agree with that. Maybe by way of sort of rounding it out, I kind of want to circle back to the Go-Betweens that we started with, and Cattle and Cane, which begins with "I recall a schoolboy coming home," and immediately establishes a tone of like looking back, and a certain nostalgia and a sort of a sepia tinted lens into childhood, which is again part of my romanticism thing I'm on. But wouldn't you know it? What does Robert Forster call his first solo album after the Go-Betweens break up? Danger in the Past.
Yes.
And it's almost like he's saying something not just about a commentary about the band and not looking back, but also about maybe that they kind of maybe their downfall was getting stuck in that mode as songwriters, and he wants to look forward and shed that nostalgic sort of way of operating. That may be completely nonsense, but it seemed to be a nice, neat bow to put on the top of this stuff. So.
Excellent. That's nice indeed. Now, I think it's important with memory. Memory is so fundamental to us all, and we both of us have quite painful memories, as does anybody from youth or from life in general. But I think it's important to positivize memory as a whole. The past can't hurt you, even if you think it can. And these records, to a certain degree, one of the real sort of wonders that I find of listening to these records is they take me back to that time. But I don't want to go back to that time. Obviously, we can't, But what is amazing about them is that I don't look back and think, oh, the mistakes I made, how unformed I was, or so. But I just feel very grateful for coming at this point of time. I don't know if these bands have been collected together and anyone else has thought about them, but I think they definitely have certain features that were common to what we were going through at that time as people. And were just incredibly important sort of signposts in the road that we went on. And so
they're definitely very informative for me, for sure. And I think we're a little different in the way that we think about memory in the past, because the past haunts me. So I think I might be the Grant to your Robert in this case.
Right. Pull yourself together, Rod, and thanks very much for your great contribution, especially the theory, which I think produced a great thread to go through it.
I hope I didn't beat it to death.
Oh no, I thought it was very interesting and made complete sense actually. So thanks for that, and I look forward to the second part of this discussion. And we're just short of an hour, and I'll stop the recording here. Many thanks.